Alright, now that we have a path node network in place and ready for our game, it's now time to turn our attention to the game itself. In this video, we are going to put together the series of classes that will be needed for the game itself. We'll get the base foundation in place for the player, enemy, and health classes. Once we have these classes set up in a base specification, we will then put together a special scene that our game is going to reside inside of. So we'll set up a game scene. We'll set up the scene with all of the basic things that we'll need to track, all of the fields that we'll need, and set it up to be able to draw first our node network and then its background graphic. Again, just to get our game foundation put together. So let's go ahead and get started with some of our new classes. Now we're going to group all of these classes into a dedicated section called Game. To do this, we'll jump into our project's properties, we'll right-click on it, and we will add in a new folder. We will call this folder Game, and we will create all of our game-related elements here inside of this folder. So we'll kick things off with the first three classes, Player, Enemy, and Health. Let's right-click on Game and add a new class. First, we will add the Player class. Next up, we'll right-click once again and add a new class. The next class will be the Enemy class. And finally, we'll create the Health class. So adding a new class for Health. We'll add this class in place. Now we're going to do a little bit of setup on each of the classes. We're not going to code the complete implementation of each, but we're going to put together some of the similar elements. The things we know about these classes is that they are all going to be actors. We're going to need a set series of using directives for each of the classes, and since the classes are actors, we need to make sure we initialize them with a texture and with a color in order to satisfy the actor's constructor. So first we can run through each of them and we can deal with our using directives and namespaces. Starting here in Health, we can work our way backwards. So inside of the Health class, we're going to begin by taking off the sub namespace of .game. We can add our using directives. The first using will be for Microsoft.xna.framework. That's Microsoft XNA and framework. We'll add a second using directive for framework.graphics. Alright, the next thing we'll do is we will establish the fact that the health class is indeed going to be an actor. Now, since it's an actor, we're going to have to specify a constructor that will allow us to access the texture and color. Now, when we're instantiating a health object, we don't want to have to worry about telling the health object what texture to use every time. We're going to set it up so that from the code inside of the class itself, we will establish our texture and color setup. So what we'll do is we will specify a constructor. In this case, it will be public health. And the constructor will actually be a parameterless constructor. Now we'll chain this to the base constructor. Now the base constructor for actor requires a texture and a color. Now we can gather these since all of our visual settings are in style. We can access these from style. For the health actor, we're going to plug in the health texture. Now for the color of the actor itself, we're going to set this here directly in the class itself. So we will simply pass in a new color, and we will set up parameters of 120 in red, 120 in blue, 120 in green, and finally 255 in blue. We can close off the parenthesis for color, a second parenthesis to close off the base constructor. Then we will specify an opening and closing brace for a method body right next to the constructor itself, since we're not going to need to place any further code in the health class's constructor. Alright, at this point we need to visit the enemy and player classes and perform the same setup procedure. To begin with, I'll copy our two using directives so that we can drop them in more quickly. We'll jump over to the enemy class now. We'll first clean up the sub namespace of game. Then we'll jump in and add our using directives. Then we can set up the inheritance for enemy. Again, enemy is going to inherit from actor And once again, it's going to need a public constructor so that we can describe the visual elements of an enemy. So our public constructor, so public, then the name here is enemy. This will once again be a parameterless constructor. We'll chain this to the base constructor where we need to pass in a texture. This texture is going to be style.arrowTexture. Both the enemy and player graphics are going to use the directional arrow texture. They'll simply differ in color. We'll use a green color for the player and a red color for the enemy. Now we get to move over to the color parameter itself, which once again will be a new color. The color here for the enemy is going to be pure red. So we're going to use a component of 255 in red, 0 for green, and 0 for blue. Then we'll close off the color and the base constructor. Once again, we will place our braces out to the side of the constructor itself. Alright, that takes care of enemy, so we can now move on to player. Inside of player, we'll begin once again by cleaning up the subnamespace of .game. We'll paste the using directives in to gain access to framework and framework.graphics. The class player is going to extend actor, and we are going to have a parameterless constructor. So public player, chained to the base constructor, we'll pass in a texture of style.arrowTexture, and this time we'll give a color of green. So we'll say new color. We'll specify a slightly lighter shade of green rather than pure green, so we'll specify red and blue components of 64. So for red here we'll have 64, for green we'll have 255, and for blue we'll have 64. We'll close off our two parentheses, and we will drop in a set of braces. In this case, we're actually going to go ahead and put the braces in right below the method itself, since in a later video we are going to be putting together some code that will need to run from the constructor. Alright, with these three classes set up, this takes care of the base setup for the player, enemy, and health actors. So now we can take a look at building a scene where all of our gameplay elements will reside. So back over to the game folder, we will add in a new class, and we will call this class Scene Game. So we'll get this class added in, perform some basic setup. We'll take out the game subnamespace. We will need some using directives, and I should still have our two using directives on the clipboard. So if I paste these in, we can very quickly drop in the framework and framework.graphics namespaces. I'm going to add one more in addition to these two. I'm also going to add a using for framework.content. Alright, now it's time to begin setting up the scene itself. The first thing to do is to establish the fact that Scene Game extends the Scene class. This will give us access to things like the build scene, update, and draw methods. Alright, now as we move into the game scene, let's put together all of the fields that we will need in order to track gameplay. Excuse me. We'll put together things such as the references to our player, enemy, and health. We'll also hold a reference for the behavior that the enemy is going to use, and we'll have a few miscellaneous fields. Let's begin with the first of these. This is going to be a float field that we will call player speed, and we will establish the player speed as a value of 5. Next up, we'll put down all of our references for the different items in the game. Again, this consists of a player, an enemy, and a health. So we'll start with the first as a player field. We'll call this player. Next, we'll have an enemy field, which we will call enemy. And finally, we will have a health field, which we will call health. Alright, after these gameplay elements, we also need to maintain a reference to the behavior that our enemy will be using. So we are going to make a behavior nav field, and we'll call this enemy nav. We need to hold on to this reference as a specific behavior navigation so that we can gain access to some of the navigational methods that this behavior contains. All right, one last thing that we'll need for the flow of our game is to hold a reference to a random object, so we can do things like implement enemy wandering. So we'll drop in a random object. We'll call this field random, and we can initialize it right off the bat with a field initializer. So random will be equal to a new instance of random. Alright, that takes care of our game's fields. So let's put together, or rather bring in, the overrides that a scene provides. These are the methods build scene, update, and draw. To begin with the first, we'll drop in our override for build scene. For each of these, I'm going to pull out the call to base, since we don't need to worry about any original code. We're specifying everything here inside of the screen game class. Alright, next up we have update. So we will override the update method, again pulling out the call to base, and finally placing an override to draw, once again removing the call to base. Alright, with these three methods in place, there are some basic things we can put together to make sure that our scene functions properly as a scene. The first of these will be to grab the drawing code that we will need, our basic draw that will allow us to do things like clear the graphics device, begin using our sprite batch, and make sure we walk through all of our actors in order to draw them. Now these things are all very standard between our different scenes, so we're actually going to begin with some existing code as a basis. We'll scroll down in our Solution Explorer to find the Scene Navigation class. Inside of Scene Navigation, we have many of these things already in place: clearing the graphics device, using the sprite batch, drawing actors. Let's grab all of these things and copy them, everything in the draw method, switch back over to the game scene, and paste all of these into draw. Now we will need to remove one line here, since the navigation scene was drawing our scene editor. So let's pull out the line to sceneEditor.draw. Alright, one last thing to set up inside of the scene itself is going to be our update method, where we're going to need to walk through all of our actors and perform an update call on each of them. So we'll put together a for each loop, and we will say for each actor in actor.actors. As we look at these actors one by one, we'll take each actor and call its update method. This way, when we begin creating things like player and enemy actors, they'll be able to behave appropriately as actors. Alright, this takes care of the foundation for the scene game class. Now let's get this game class tied in from the actual game itself. If we bring up our game's game1 class, we can see that if we look at the load content method, we have the line where we are instantiating a specific kind of scene, and currently that is a navigation scene. Let's change this over to be an instance of scene game. Now the moment we do this, we can go ahead and run. This will first make sure that our base definitions are working well, and we can also see what this brand new scene looks like. If we build and run, we can see that we're presented with a completely blank screen. And this makes sense since we have not instantiated any actors and we have not brought in any nodes. So now to begin bringing in some elements that we can see, let's begin with the node network. Let's go back over to the game scene, and let's begin in the build scene method. Let's bring in that path node network that we had created earlier. Now since we had saved that network file out in the same directory as the game's executable, we can load it back in using a relative path. We'll do this using the node.io class. We will execute a call to load nodes, and we will pass in the name map.txt. So here's a case where we are directly loading in a set of nodes without invoking the load dialog. We're simply assuming that a file exists and bringing it directly into the scene. Let's rerun and make sure that we can see all of our nodes loaded back in, and we can see the node network that we had drawn out earlier. Now we need to get the background graphic to draw inside of the game itself. So let's scroll down to our draw method, right below the spriteBatch.begin line. Let's put together a draw call that will draw the background texture. This will be spriteBatch.draw. we'll draw the texture that is style.background texture. We'll draw this texture at a position of 0, so vector2.0. And finally, we will specify a color of white. Alright, once again, let's rerun and verify that we do see the texture being drawn. We see the node network placed into that texture inside of our scene. So at this point, we have our base gameplay classes all set up. We have a player, an enemy, and a health class. And we have also constructed a game scene for all of these elements to reside within. So with this, the game's foundation is in place, and it's now time to move on.